I'd like to just start with asking you to introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Miranda Cuckson, and I am a violinist and a violist and a
All
teacher.
right. So I wanted to ask you how you might approach like different ways of performing or interpreting modern classical pieces compared to the more traditional pieces.
Yeah, I think there's such a huge variety of music that's being written nowadays. So it's so wide open. A lot of the process has to do with simply, yeah, figuring out what kind of a piece it is, what kind of composer this person is. Um, so sometimes things do fall into certain styles. You can kind of relate it to something you've heard or something you've played.
Mm,
Um, but there's a real openness to the possibilities that I always love. There's always a kind of suspense about what is this, what is this new piece I'm looking at, you know? So there's a certain amount of just, yeah, looking at everything that's in the score and then finding out more about the composer or meeting them.
mm.
Um, yeah.
With these all new things in the modern classical music, do you think there's some challenges to interpreting these new classical pieces or like yeah.
Um, I would say the challenges can be, um, yeah, sometimes just understanding a score. Sometimes, I mean, I think a challenge for a lot of composers is figuring out how to write down their ideas.
Mm,
So that can be in a more conventional ways, but sometimes there are things that, um, yeah, you need to understand how they're using
mm,
uh, some of the some of the notation and symbols that we do know, but they have their own uses for.
mm,
Sometimes they've come up with some other kinds of notation. Um, and then when those are translated into sounds and techniques, sometimes that means just absorbing a whole new uh, kind of array of yeah, techniques, movements,
mhm.
and getting those in your ear too. So those can be challenges.
Right. Like, how do you get to learn the new techniques? If there's like a certain way they want you to play it, or
Um, well, well, it depends. I mean, so there's a whole category that we call extended techniques in a general way, which means ways of producing sound on these uh, more standard instruments like
mhm,
a violin, piano, flute, etc.
mhm,
But going beyond the kind of basic training of how you play these instruments, how do you make the the ideal sound on these instruments, but also finding more possibilities and um, all the ways, all the kind of mechanical ways that these instruments can actually make sound.
mhm.
Sometimes those are even a bit more percussive, for instance, um, or less having to do with pitch, you know. Excuse me. So some of that is kind of like in a choreographic way. You kind of learn how to, um, yeah, your body gets used to going from one movement to another. It's a bit of a different sort of choreography.
Mm,
Um, and then part of it is just kind of the fun process of experimenting yourself, because composer might have an idea like, oh, make a like a breathy sound with this kind of bow stroke or something. But within that description, there's all kinds of things to find. Um, just like in traditional playing, you know, there's a many ways to play that cantabile or something. So also getting into the experimentation yourself.
I see. That's really interesting because actually today I took talked to Anna Wiesner, and she was
Oh,
talking
yeah.
about like how composing helps her sort of find like something surprising in herself, surprised by herself
Hmm.
as well. And she's talking a lot about like storytelling using her contemporary music. Do you think sometimes it's more helpful to like collaborate with a composer when you're trying to navigate their piece?
It can definitely be great to collaborate with them, whether it's from the very early stages of something,
Hmm.
um, or once they've written it and then you're just working together on the actual performance. At either stage, it can be really um, satisfying. But yeah, coming up with these um, yeah, stories or pictures or things that you both want to explore, you both bring your own experiences to.
Mm.
It can be a really fun process.
Nice. Like, what do you think? I mean, other than time period, like, what's the biggest difference between modern classical music and more traditional classical music?
Um, well, I think that's actually a pretty
Yeah.
tricky question. But I mean, in some very fundamental ways, I think it's not different really at
Mm,
all. It's still and always was about very personal expression and uh, but I think um, as I was saying, that it's so wide open in terms of the possibilities and the kinds of musical languages you might use.
mm,
Everyone is so exposed to so many things. So um, I think there's a real freedom to not only to just pick among these, but even to use just an element of this and an element of that and bring all these things together. So, I've there was also that happening even for Mozart, even for Bach, like Bach was listening to Italian music or Mozart was absorbing a lot of other things. So it's not to say they were not, but they were, I think, to a greater degree working within like a certain language,
yeah,
and it had certain formulas in
yeah.
terms of phrases and of course the system of tonality. So I mean, I mentioned Mozart just now, but it's like what's so remarkable with him is that he was using all that, but he was constantly, well, you mentioned surprise just now, but he's like constantly twisting it a little bit
Mm,
um, with like the phrase lengths or the harmony going a certain way. So he always made it his own
mm,
and um, made it fresh and changing all the time.
mm,
Whereas a composer who was a little, less creative or um, inspired with it would stick more to those formulas, right?
yeah,
So I think, yeah, in those days, things tended to fall more into the vocabulary and into the language. And now it's just so open, but that also has to do with the culture, right? Because this music came from those countries, like
right.
Austria, Germany.
Mhm,
Um, and now it's the whole world is being part of this thing we call classical music. That's why it's very complicated now.
right.
Um, but it's a big mishmash.
Yeah. I think what you're talking about, like the different, like now we have a lot more composers who are willing to kind of like break that system of tonality that you're talking about. I think it's so new and like awesome, awesome, but it's also what also veers a lot of people away from classical contemporary music. And I was wondering if you have any tips for people to try to warm up to it a bit more.
Yeah, well, the thing about tonality is a very big question. I mean, that really came up in the last century in a big way, um, with atonality and 12-tone music and this kind of thing. And I think, as I was saying, now there's kind of everything. So so first of all, there is a lot of new music that is using quite familiar tonal
Mm,
language. But I think there's less of a kind of sort of taking it for granted kind of root in that.
mhm,
And some composers are definitely writing quite atonal stuff. So I think the thing is to kind of embrace the abstraction of that music.
mm,
Um, kind of like in visual art where um, people used to just paint representationally, paint pictures of people and landscapes and
mhm,
objects, and then we latch onto those things immediately. And tonality is very similar in that way because it's so powerful um, in a really innate way. It seems
mm,
like to a little kid, they just will hear the chord progressions and kind of respond to it like it's very basic song forms.
mm,
Um, so that's just something we know. And so we kind of get a meaning immediately from it. But if you take that away and you make things much more free harmonically um, and sometimes dissonant as well, then it becomes a more kind of abstract experience, sort of like looking at abstract painting.
mm,
You're looking at shapes and colors and kind of finding meaning in those for yourself.
right,
So it's really um yeah, it's really kind of embracing
mm,
that experience of just listening and just finding what that means to you. And some of it's also about, I mean, there are other things really conveyed in it, like energy, for
mhm,
instance. You can look at a Kandinsky painting and it's full of all this swirls of color and this, and you've got to say there's a lot of energy in that painting.
right.
I don't know what it means exactly,
Yeah.
like, but yeah, what it's depicting, but there's definitely some real energy there. And sometimes in music too, it's like you're getting an experience of a kind of energy, um, which is a different kind of experience
Mm,
than a melody where you feel like there's a beginning and an end to it, and it had a climax and a resolution or whatever. It's a different kind of experience.
how did you sort of warm up to like contemporary classical music? Like, did you start as a student?
Yeah. Well, I got really into it, I would say, in my 20s, but when I was much younger and had to play a contemporary piece for some audition or
Mm,
jury or something, I did always really like it.
mm,
Um, I always found it a really interesting and intriguing kind of thing to do.
mm,
Um, so looking back, I realized that I had that kind of openness to it and curiosity.
mm,
Um, and I enjoyed that process. Yeah, my father's also a composer, so I did have that in the house.
yeah.
Um, yeah, he's also a teacher. He teaches a lot of the kind of nuts and bolts stuff of like theory and counterpoint. And and he didn't really write anything for me until I was grown up. So um so kind of that influence was there for sure.
Mhm,
Um, but kind of my own interest in it kind of came to me
mm.
casually.
So, do you feel that like some of them, did you ever feel like some of them like misconceptions about like modern classical music ever kind of stopped you from playing it? I'm not sure, but I feel like that's what stops a lot of people that I know.
Oh, yeah. The misconceptions being like, well, people won't enjoy
Yeah.
it, or it's not as yeah, not as popular to
Mhm,
listen to. Um, Yeah, I mean, when I got into it, I was just really I was so interested in it, and I found it very communicative and expressive. And I guess I did find playing it that I had a lot of positive experiences um from listeners. I mean, I might have been playing for a certain kind of audience, I don't know, like um but I did feel like I was getting great feedback,
Mm.
and I was very uh yeah, I was finding it really satisfying musically to work on. I mean, of course, like anybody, sometimes I feel like, oh, I wish there were, like everybody loved this music and it had, a big kind of big fan base or whatever. But I think um yeah, there definitely are always people who have that kind of eagerness for something new,
Mm.
and they're not only going to concerts just to hear their old favorite um Tchaikovsky symphony or whatever,
Mm.
which is wonderful too, but there's that certain kind of audience. And I did always feel like, yes, there are those people who want to.
Right. Do you think there's a good way to make it more accessible to a wider audience? Like, advertise it better, maybe?
um well, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things have been tried.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people have tried to like, make it hip or to share a lot of personal stuff about um yeah, their adventures with it or their feelings about it. And I think um yeah, I mean, I really don't know that there's any thing really different that
Mm.
and I do also feel, I have to say that having been in this for at least this solidly like the last 15 years or
Mm-hmm.
more, but I feel like um there is more new music and classical programming. Like it has made its way into the mainstream
Mm-hmm.
much more. There are always those more very traditional places they're kind of reluctant or something. But
Mm.
I feel like a lot of the orchestras and the presenters have much more awareness of it now, and are trying to support more composers in their programs, like having a composer in residence or um, doing a commission
Mm.
or a few of them a year. Yeah, like even the Met Opera here is now doing like lots of new opera. They've actually found it's pretty popular.
Mm.
Um, so I think there has been a kind of a tide shifting, but
Mm.
there's always this kind of tension, with
Yeah.
the classical music, because there's some people who really feel like, no, this is what I love, and that's what I'm coming to hear.
Mhm.
And so yeah, there's always a bit of this
Yeah.
struggle, which it's really shouldn't have to be that way. Like it's really a big continuum of music,
Mm.
and sometimes I feel like people get kind of hostile toward one or the other, like
Yeah.
um but I feel like in some places it's all coming closer.
Mm. I think I was wondering whether you think that like new classical music should be implemented into like education of just classical music. Like I feel like usually people think you have to, know all the Beethovens and all that before maybe veering to something different, but I'm not sure.
uh um in terms of
Like as a
studying.
foundation for
Mhm.
like yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm pretty open-minded in terms of people's roots.
Mm.
Roots, ROUTES.
Okay.
Um, also their own roots, but their roots to yeah, to the music, what angle they're coming from.
Yeah.
I also know composers who have not come from a particularly classical kind of
Mm.
background, but are now writing what would be called like concert music, classical concert music. Um, yeah. I mean, I do think it's great if contemporary music can be introduced as soon as possible. So even little kids who are just learning their instruments get to play some pieces by living composers that they're able to play. And if they can even meet these people or at least watch a video of them or something and they see, oh, this is the person who wrote this. And so that's just the natural um, part of music making to them. I think that would be wonderful. I think the other thing is for the training of the instruments, like violin, for instance, it's just I mean, there are also many violin traditions around the world. That's another part of it too. But I think to learn the tradition that we're talking about, the sort of Western classical tradition, then I think it's kind of important to go through a certain amount of that traditional repertoire, right?
Yeah.
Um, just in terms of understanding what the instrument is about and
Mm.
how those ideals of how that technique and those ideals of what that sound is and what the style of music written for it is.
Mhm.
Um, just you get enough of that. Um, and then you can move on to do anything. And yeah, but there are, like I said, there are players who just come from up different angles on it.
Mm. Do you teach like modern music to your students?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I have a 6-year-old now. I just gave a little modern.
Really?
But yeah, but I mostly teach in the college. I'm trying yeah, I'm always trying to get more of those pieces in there. Everyone, of course, has a lot on their plate in terms of the repertoire and because they have auditions for this and that and requirements. Of course, those places are also trying to get more new music into there. But
Right.
I also just have people, because I do a lot of new music, some people just come and they want to play their contemporary piece for me. They want to come and play the Barrio Sequenza or the Carter or something, so I do a lot of that also.
Um, like how do you think is a good way for students to sort of find modern classical music?
Yeah, well, there's a lot, right? But I think there are several ways. One is, first of all, just be aware of what's going on in the concert world
Mhm.
around. Sometimes people are just not really paying much attention, and it's good to know, yeah, what's around and what people have taken interest in.
Mhm.
Um, then there are ways to research it.
Mm.
There are some kinds of databases out there that have a lot of pieces on them, uh, and also libraries
Mhm.
and things like that. Use all those resources.
Mhm.
Um, you can also look at new music organizations and ensembles. They often have a repertoire list, or just look through their programming to get some ideas or references. And from there, you can kind of go down a rabbit hole and find more and more things. Another thing is through social media.
Mhm.
Um, social media is kind of a fraught thing, and I don't think it's not so much for just like constantly putting stuff on or whatever, but I think one of the best things about it is if you connect with a lot of musicians and with composers,
Mm.
um, you just develop a network there, and both from following what they are doing and what their colleagues are doing. And also sometimes if you just have a question, you can just put it and people will either be like, hey, I have a piece. Or some people will be like, I just played this piece, and you have an instrumentation. That can be a really, yeah, really helpful way. And it's also a bit more personal. You get to,
Yeah, I can see how that's like a good community. Like,
yeah, I think that's really actually one of the best uses of social media. Besides just like announcing your next concert or your project,
yeah.
which is like useful. But aside from that, it's just that having that, yeah, that community, that network of
Mm.
people.
And just because I'm curious, how do you feel about like AI sort of being integrated into classical music nowadays?
Yeah. Well, AI is yeah, become a big thing very recently.
Right?
Um, well, um, I'm, I'm wary of the idea that these things could um, replace human
Yeah.
creativity in any sort of meaningful way.
Mm.
Um, I think the whole thing about art is that knowing that another person uh, made this and is offering it. And some of it also art is it's partly you're kind of communicating with yourself, right? In terms of discovering um yeah, what's going on inside of you and manifesting it there. And then some of it's also a conscious sort of reaching out to other people and wanting to share that. And that's the kind of that being the whole context of what it is such a um meaningful part of it, and kind of the specificity of the individual, or as a group event can be, of course, collaborative and group of individuals, but it's still a certain uh, um, bunch of people doing that.
Mm.
And AI, I feel like it like all kind of tools that humans come up with, it there probably can be great uses for it, and to make some things super efficient, and to create lots of possibilities that we couldn't on a kind of more normal time scale, and
Mhm.
in terms of workload and that sort of thing. So it feels like something that should be harnessed for um, as a tool.
Right.
Um, but the idea that, oh yeah, we don't need the movie industry anymore. We don't need composers. And,
Mhm.
it's yeah, seems silly and unfortunate, but
Yeah.
well, I guess we'll see what people come up with.
What do you think are some struggles that composers might deal with maybe the reputation that modern classical music has?
Yeah, well, there is that struggle in terms of people's perception. Um, but I think a lot of composers, especially in this kind of current era, I think a lot of composers are actually very motivated by trying to uh, connect to people, and it's actually a very social thing. Um, just their motivation for making music, writing music.
Mhm.
So I think as much as they can just sincerely um, uh, communicate that about their music, um, And yeah, and then having a sort of that network of support among performers and presenters to really yeah, get what they're trying to create and share that together. I think that just makes it all the more powerful. Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's all I have for questions for you. But is there anything else you'd like to add?
Uh, Not really, but it's wonderful you're doing this.
All right, thank you.
So I'm happy that young people are, yeah, taking such an interest. And
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's so great that you're following up with what we're up to, that you took your time again today. So just so grateful for that.
it's great to talk with you.
Yeah, all right. We should keep in touch.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'll see
Yeah.
you next time.
Okay.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye.